Hey guys, Lee Reddit here with Shipyard Training. Today we're going to talk about the introduction to safety, what's required to work at a shipyard. There's a written exam that you'll be required to take, and you must get at least an 80% to successfully complete that before you'll be allowed to work at a shipyard. There's a lot of information. So what I'm going to do, instead of trying to go through, 1, 2, 3, 4 hours of training, we're going to try to break it down to 15, 20-minute segments and do it in 1, 2, 3 sections. That way it'll help you to stay engaged with what we're doing. And it'll also help you when it comes time to take your exam. We'll give you a preliminary test that you can take. That way you'll be more prepared when it gets to it. So, safety is the most important part of everything that we do in the shipyard. There are some ways to control safety, and so what is called is the hierarchy of controls. So number one, can you eliminate the hazard? So you have to do what is called a JSA, Job Safety Analysis, before starting work. During that analysis, what you're looking for is to identify any safety hazards. Okay, so once you've identified the safety hazard, how do you control it, or what do you do? Number one, can you eliminate it? Can you physically remove the hazard? It's a can of paint. It's a hazard. Remove it. Okay, that would be number one. Substitution, replace the hazard. Is there a way to protect it or a way to move the hazard? Substitution. Number three, engineer controls. Isolate from people. Can you put a protective barrier? We'll say there's a hole in the deck. So what we do is we put what they call stanchions or piece of angle around the hole. We put cable in those stanchions. It makes it like a temporary fence. We put caution tape on there. Do not go past this right here because there's a hole in the deck. So that would be engineered controls. Then you have administrative controls that you change the way that people work. Can you take the job and let's say that we're building a foundation and you're building that foundation in a compartment on the ship. Can we take and move that to the shop to build it? Can we go work on it up on the deck on the outside of the ship? Can we go somewhere else because there's other hazards that we're dealing with in that particular space? And then the last but not least is protect the worker by PPE, called personal. What does PPE stand for? Personal protective equipment. Personal protective equipment. Now, there are some things that's going to be required at all times while working on a ship or industrial areas. Hard hat, safety glasses, and safety shoes. Now, for the maritime industry, you're going to find when you're working on a ship that you're not only required to have a safety shoe, meaning a steel composite alloy toe, but you also have to have a minimum of a 1/4 inch defined heel. The reason that they do that is because the environments that we're working in, people are spilling things on decks. Sometimes the decks are wet. Your shoes get wet. You go to climb on a ladder, and that creates an extra measure of protection if you have a heel on there that will keep you from your foot from slipping while you're walking. And you'll be walking up and down ladders all day, and that's just the way ships are designed. So the minimum PPE is hard hat, safety glasses, and safety shoes, but there'll be other things that you'll use PPE for certain jobs. Let's say the job hazard is we're working in an elevated area. If you're working in an area where, and don't take too much emphasis on these measurements and things I'm telling you right now, because we'll have one section that is about harness. Okay, that will tell you how to wear the harness, what to check for, how do you connect it, what do you do with it. We'll have a section on that, but just for the sake of this right here, if you were wearing a harness, if you're standing 5 foot off the deck, you're required to wear a harness in the maritime industry. If it's an unguarded edge, 5 foot off the deck, you're required to wear a harness. Okay, so that would be another form of PPE. If you're using a grinder, there's sparks, there's metal shavings flying. Anytime there's flying or falling objects that can strike you from in the face, in the eyes, you must wear eye and face protection, which is a face shield. Okay, that's PPE. Gloves. If you're using a grinder, you're required to use leather gloves while you're grinding. Keep from burning your hands. We're required to wear long sleeves. If the noise above 85 decibels, okay, what is 85 decibels? Here's a rule of thumb. If you have to raise your voice to be heard 2 to 3 feet away, you need hearing protection. If you're using a grinder, you are required to have hearing protection while you're using the grinder. They feel like that could damage your hearing. It's above 85 decibels you're required to wear. Now, another form of PPE is a respirator, okay? And we'll talk about the respirator in its own section, but I'm giving you a general introduction to the safety requirements for shipyard. Fumes, dust, smoke, to any toxic atmosphere, you are required to wear a respirator. Fumes, dust, smoke, toxic atmosphere, you're required to wear a respirator. A respirator would be another form of PPE. So that's just a kind of a basic introduction to the PPE that you would be using in the shipyard. The other thing is if you're working over water, common sense, you're working over water, unguarded edge, you would wear a life vest. A life vest would be a form of PPE. There's some other things that we'll talk about, the types of hearing protection when we get to that section. Some of those things we'll talk about as we go. But for today, the introduction to safety, I want you to understand the minimum PPE, hard hat, safety glasses, and safety shoes are required when working on a ship or in an industrial area. Okay, so that's just about 7.5 minutes. We're not going to have a test with this particular section. I would take some notes if I was you, just to kind of refresh. You could go back and watch this again if you didn't get it the first time around. But we'll go to the next section where we'll break down the PPE that we're required to wear. We'll give you a little bit more detail about each one of those. But just for the sake of time and to keep from boring you to death, the next section, number 2, this is the basic introduction to safety, what PPE is required. The next section we're going to do is hot work. In order to work on a ship, everybody that works on a ship must understand the requirements for doing hot work. How do you do an inspection? What are you looking for? What PPE are you required to have? What other, the engineering controls, protective measures, what are we required to do? And what is the paperwork that's required for doing hot work? A hot work training is a little bit more in-depth. But anyway, I think you'll learn a lot from that. And that'll be the next section. So without anything else, guys, I hope you didn't go to sleep during this last 8 minutes. Like I said, if you didn't catch something, go back and look at it again, and we'll see you next time. Y'all have a great day and stay safe.